birthday. And so as he mentioned, he told my dad he would look after me. And so, he's here, my mother's here. So normally at this time, I'm supposed to, the candidate stands up and gives you that 3-minute stump speech. I'm a little emotional and I don't think I can make it through that. But what I would like to take the opportunity to do is to kind of freestyle a little bit. And it's such a warm feeling because most of you I know. And for others, I feel like since I'm the only one talking, maybe I should take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my background. And then if you know my background, you'll have a better understanding of why I make certain decisions and why certain things are important to me. So, oh, by the way, I'm Antanette and I'm running for city council. That I never thought I'd be saying because I'm not a politician. As many know, I'm an attorney by profession, so I consider myself an advocate. So let's keep that in mind. Just by way of background, I was raised here in Asheville, grew up in the East End community. My father was a pastor of Nazareth First Baptist Church, and my mother was a teacher. We lived there until I was 12. But prior to that, because my parents were activists by nature and really into education, they kind of, I'm going to say, threw me to the wolves, and I integrated what was the then St. Eugene Catholic School when I was 5 years old. One reason this particular place is important to me is, well, let me go back and say, I grew up in a household where the saying was you have to be twice as good to get half as much. And education was key. And you're not going to embarrass us. So, because my mother was a teacher, she made sure that I was on point. And you know who else made sure I had it together? Black women teachers in this community, many of whom were members of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. So the reason this living room is important to me is the owner of the house before the Bells was Mr. Hale, and his wife was a teacher. So as a little girl, I spent a lot of time in this very room getting my lesson because the group of teachers, they tutored me a year in advance so that when it came time to do my work and to get my grades, I could be the A. So no one could say, you're just here riding on somebody's coattails or anything like that. After I finished St. Eugene, I went on to Asheville School, graduated from the Asheville School. After Asheville School, I went on to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Shout out to an example of good decision making on my part. And then I knew I wanted to be an attorney since I was 8 years old, and so that's what I did. Early in my practice, I handled litigation matters, specifically intellectual property, so copyrights and trademarks. But my pro bono work always centered around protecting victims of domestic violence and civil rights. So when people ask me what my proudest legal accomplishment is, I always refer to represent the Martin Luther King Jr. estate in a matter against the CBS. I spent a lot of my 20s, well, most of my 20s and some of my 30s in Atlanta, and my mother passed when I was in my 30s. And when that happened in 2007, I began splitting my time equally between Asheville and Atlanta. And at that time, I feel like I started getting back kind of in the groove. My father, as he aged, his sight had gone, many years before. But then but his mind was always, everyone will tell you, his mind was always very sharp. And his body kind of gave out on him. So in 2016, I returned full time and left my practice and started working for an organization that develops affordable housing, right? And little did I know then, right, you know how everything happens for a reason, you just don't know what it is. Now, that's one of the biggest issues we have going, and I'm deeply steeped in that. So I come back, and at that point, I started noticing, once again, love from the community. He often would fall, and there was a time when I was faced with my own health issue, and I had to be back out of town, you know, getting my treatment. And EMS firefighters, they were there a couple of times a week, to the point that they would call me. And the level of gratitude that I have for them, I can't express. And also law enforcement, because there came a time when, because I grew up in a household where compassion was always at the fore, we dealt with folks on their worst days. And sometimes people mistake your kindness for weakness. So it wasn't uncommon for our home to be burglarized. And it got to the place where I felt that it was a dangerous situation for my dad. And law enforcement in Asheville stepped up and looked out for them. So, if law enforcement is here, if anyone says to you that council does not support law enforcement, you turn around and you tell them no, right? You say at least one, right, does. And is Quentin back here?
Yeah.
Love you, bro. So that part, you know, and so the question then becomes, why did I decide to even submit for the appointed position? So I was appointed to council. I've never run before. I was appointed at the end of 2020 in the midst of the lockdown. Remember how scared you were? Right at the end of 2020. As I mentioned, I've had pretty significant health issues, and at that time, earlier in the year, my father had, he had been hospitalized. We now think he probably had COVID, we just didn't know what it was. And at the time of the shutdown, he was in rehab against the states. So that horrible period when nothing could go. I mentioned before that I often would do civil rights, pro bono work. And I often did, you know, election protection type things. So I was kind of losing my mind in the middle of national protests, and I felt like there was nothing I could do. So when the seat came open, I was like, that's something I can do from behind, you know, my counter. And it didn't occur to me that y'all would actually pick me. And I was like, oh, okay. But what I will say is I enjoy the work. And I think what is most beneficial for me is the deep roots I have in the community. So it was something where I could just start and just run with it. My father has since passed, and if I'm being honest, there was a part of me who really thought, wouldn't be so bad to move on. And I feel comfortable saying that because I know who's in the room, and I know that there are a lot of us who care so deeply about the community. We will stay even if it feels like we're making a sacrifice. So if you ask me why I'm running, it is because I owe a debt. And it's never just a debt to one person, it's truly to the community, the Asheville community. One thing I always tell people, you know, I mentioned earlier that we moved from East End when I was 12. What I didn't say was, we lived in the church parsonage until I was 12. My parents had been married 20 years before they bought their first home. So I currently live in Kenilworth And I live in a nice house in Kenilworth. It's a nice area. But it's not lost on me that, just think about it, if you never had to pay a mortgage for 20 years, that gives you a leg up. And the reason that was that way was because of the Black community that supported us always. And I use my parents as an example. My father told me that's why he and my mother were always involved with sometimes characters that people just want to throw aside. I look back and I'm like, wow, we had people who were in shelters just staying with us. And many of you know, we didn't have a lock on our door, we had a keypad. And many people in the community knew that number, so it was not uncommon for me to walk home and someone I didn't know would be seated at the living room table or dining room table waiting on. So I owe you, I really do. The deep-rooted history and my analytical skills, I believe, are well suited for this position. Every decision I make, I look at it from a place of compassion, a place of common sense, right, and a place of community. So I know I'm supposed to stand here and say these are my top 3, things, but the truth of the matter is it doesn't matter what the issue is. As long as I lead with those prongs, I think we get to a good place. I want to say a few things. Just a reminder, please sign up if you're willing to help. And what I'm hoping to do is just meet with folks one-on-one and take your questions and any interest. And I thank you so much for coming, because it was a cold, ugly day, and you could have been a lot of places, and you were here, and I so appreciate it. And thank you very much.